Welcome to this special conversation around the union budget. So much has been said and so much has been discussed. It's almost threadbare now, but we thought we'd break this down into three key pillars for anyone who's still trying to assess the budget in terms of the boxes it checked and the ones that it didn't. Joining me to do that are two gentlemen, Vivek Kaul, author and financial columnist, and Mihir Sharma, senior fellow at ORF. Gentlemen, welcome. I'm hoping this is going to be a really fiery debate, so don't go agreeing on everything on me. That won't make it fun at all. But I thought we could divide this up on three sort of key parameters: consolidation, spending, and of course, the most important, revival. And then we see what the budget report card looks like. So let's start with consolidation first. Vivek, first word from you. I know we spoke around the budget as well, but those fiscal deficit figures, first up, that came as a positive surprise, even though the figures were nasty in themselves.
Right. So, I mean, a part of the fiscal deficit, not all of it, and the part which essentially came from the fact that the government up until now had not been declaring the food subsidy number properly. And so this year, basically, what has happened is that all the food subsidies that, or rather a good portion of the food subsidies that the government owed to the Food Corporation of India has been declared as an expenditure. And because of that, the fiscal deficit number has gone up to 9.5% of the GDP. Having said that, there are other reasons as well. The disinvestment number, which the government had hoped to earn around 2.1 lakh crore, and now they'll end up with something like 32,000 crore. So that is a huge gap of 1.78 lakh crore. So that, I don't think, that is a failure on part of the government. I mean, I wouldn't call it a positive surprise. I mean, one can understand that they wouldn't probably have managed to earn the very, very optimistic 2.1 lakh crore, but 32,000 crore, which is around 15% of the number, is too bad. The other two things that have happened is that the tax revenues essentially, they did not live up to the projected number. Neither did the non-tax revenue. So, basically the fiscal deficit went up because of these four reasons, and in which I guess the tax and the non-tax you could probably say was because of COVID. The disinvestment numbers were also impacted because of COVID. But if you look at the fact that during the second half of the year, or probably from almost from May on, the stock market has really, really rallied. So I really don't know as to why the government has not been able to raise a lot more money through disinvestment. Uh, and the positive surprise, obviously, is the fact that the food subsidy numbers have been declared properly, and they will continue to be declared properly in the years to come. So.
Meir, so let's look forward with that a little bit in terms of what they've guided to for the year ahead. Again, a high fiscal deficit figure. As Vivek said, the expenditure secretary has said the assumption is all subsidies will remain. So, would you draw positives and negatives from the forward-looking figure?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at this. The first is that um, the 3 points actually. The first is that the fact that the food subsidies have been brought onto the government's own books, which, as Vivek said, is a good thing. It may mean that essentially the earlier target of 3% for the fiscal deficit eventually of 3% of GDP would have to be adjusted. And that clearly is what the government thinks, because they have given a very, very slow glide path down to 4.5% of GDP for the fiscal deficit over the next 6 years. Now, frankly, while I do agree that it's a good thing to get the food subsidy numbers on the budget, that should not mean that you abandon the 3% target. That should not mean that you give yourself quite so much room to get down to the target, etc. I think the other thing that could be said maybe on the credit side for the fiscal numbers is that in spite of them assuming that there will be a reasonable bounce back to growth next year, and I don't think that their growth estimate numbers are really out of whack. They've said 14.5 or 14.6% nominal growth, and it's that's probably not impossible, given the low base of the pandemic year. But they have also assumed that tax to GDP, the tax to GDP ratio remains around 9.8, 9.9. And what that means is they haven't really built in a big assumption about the growth of tax revenue next year. And which is why they've got this 6.8% fiscal deficit for the forthcoming fiscal year, which I think is a lot, but builds in these two assumptions. First, that we've got this food subsidy on the accounts now, and second, that we're not assuming a lot of tax buoyancy next year. So it's possible that that will surprise on the upside. All right. As and when we talk about the budget next year, they've met and exceeded their fiscal deficit target. But that said, the broader idea here is that they have given themselves, I think, way too much room going forward with the fiscal deficit.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I think one of the reasons why they have been slightly less optimistic about tax collections in 21-22 lies in the fact that the tax collections in 18-19 and 19-20 were both extremely optimistic. So in 19-20, they ended up with around with a number which was 12.5% lower, and in 18-19 it was around 8.5% lower. So I guess that comes from experience in the past 2 years where they were not able to earn the kind of gross tax revenues that they expected to. So.
Let me ask you this, because we were talking earlier about why the stock market rallied so much, and in part it's to do with the fact that the markets love expansionary policies. They love to see this fiscal profligacy happening, perhaps in the hope that the government is going to spend. Would you be hopeful of that, or would you be cautious that this is not going to be such a spend as you move kind of year for us?
Well, the government, the Modi administration's default has always been a little bit of fiscal restraint. And my assumption is that this comes from the personality of the Prime Minister and his experience in Gujarat. But it's possible that that's shifted. And I fear that that has shifted. I've written a column worrying that that has shifted, in which case the stock market is not wrong. But look, Mithali, it's for people who aren't really thinking about this too hard, there's a very simple, balance. You see, if the government is spending a bit, if it's not worrying about, if it's got a fiscal deficit that's going up, then the assumption is that inflation will go higher. The assumption is that that means that corporate earnings are the best place to put, best things to bet on. Corporate earnings will go up, stock market will go up, the bond market will go down. And I think that sort of, that balance is what we're seeing here. That people are just looking at this and saying, okay, it looks like we're moving into territory where there are going to be inflationary pressures. We're already at inflation that's 6.7, 6.8. And going forward, this means that the stock market is where your money should be. And I mean, maybe Vivek has a better.
I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah.
So, if you look at the numbers of the budget carefully, and I mean, I'll talk about the overall expenditure and then I'll talk about the capital expenditure. The numbers tell you a different story, even though the media has gone around, telling the world that the government is spending its way out of trouble. So have the fund managers. But if you look at the numbers carefully, they tell you a different story. So if you look at the total expenditure for 21-22, that stands at 34.83 lakh crore. If you look at total expenditure for 2021, it is at 34.5 lakh crore. So there is not much of a difference. Also, the interest payments in 21-22 are at around 8.1 lakh crore, whereas interest payments this year are around 6.92 lakh crore. So once you adjust for that, it's you end up in a situation where you are actually spending lesser money next year than you are this year. Then if you adjust for the extra food subsidy numbers, you end up spending a little more next year, but it's not a huge difference. On the capital expenditure front, it's
before you move to capex, I just want to, for someone who's watching, just to sort of simplify this, and part of the problem is because we're looking at budgeted estimates, right? We're not looking at what the government actually ended up spending, and that's when you do that comparison is when you see that there's not too much of any sort of incremental spending at all, correct?
No. What? See, in fact, okay. Now let me just go into a little more detail. See, so See, what I'll do is I'll make the capital expenditure point and I'll answer that question as well. Okay. So if you look at capital expenditure, the finance minister said in her speech that capital expenditure next year will go up by 34% to around 5.54 lakh crore. Now the problem, which is, and what she did was she compared the budgeted estimate for next year with the budgeted estimate for this year. If you compare it with the revised estimate, it goes up by around 26%, which in itself is a very big number. But what happens is that this is not the complete story, because it does not take into account the off-budget expenditure, off-budget capital expenditure that is also declared in as a part of the budget. So if you add both of the numbers together and you get with what is called as the total government expenditure, that goes up by around next year it grows by around 5%. To 11.37 lakh crore. So that is not a huge jump, and that is the right way to look at it. Now if you look at now let's talk about 2020. If you look at 2020-21, so if you look at 2020-21, the total capital expenditure, the revised number is slightly less than the budgeted number. So what that tells you is that no extra spending is happening on the capital front in the aftermath of COVID, because the budgeted number was declared before the COVID pandemic hit the country.
Mihir, you want to jump in?
So essentially, I think that, the exact numbers here are interesting. On the revenue expenditure net of interest, right? And remember, in many ways, it's revenue expenditure that when people think about a stimulus, for example, they're thinking in terms of revenue expenditure. What is the government directly putting out there into the hands of the people one way or the other? And the revenue expenditure net of interest has fallen as compared to the revised estimates. It's fallen by a lot. It's fallen by 8.6%. And that's quite a big deal. All right. So I think we have to recognize this is not a stimulus budget. And the government accepts this. What the government believes is that every time the Prime Minister stood up and said, which he said several times, please see this budget as one in a series of moves that we have taken over the pandemic. What he was trying to say was that we have spent our stimulus already. We have raised our welfare. We have raised our welfare payments. Now the time for me to go back to capital expenditure. Now the time for me to change the quality of how the government is spending, etc. And the government has always believed that it can take on debt, it can create infrastructure as a government, and that is the best way to get to growth. We can debate whether that's the right way to think about growth momentum at this point in time. But this is what the government has felt previously, and they're doubling down on that even in the post-pandemic year.
So let's shift from spending to revival and, take up this point that Mihir made, Vivek. What was disappointing for me personally was also to see a lot of the social welfare schemes actually got less, which is part of what, the point that Mihir is making. So NREGA has been allocated less. Health has got so much clubbed in it, including things like drinking water, wellness, and in fact, critical pillars like nutrition have got significantly less in this budget, 27% less. Do you agree with that argument that Mihir puts forth, which is that the government is saying, yes, we are not spending on those kind of categories because we're spending on things like capex, and that's what's going to ultimately really bolster growth?
Actually, they're not spending more on capex also. As I said, the incremental spending is around 5%. And if you actually look at capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP, that number has come down. So here's the thing. What has happened is that the fiscal deficit has shot up to such a huge number that they really are not in a position to do much unless they borrowed, they sort of ran the kind of fiscal deficit they have this year, next year as well. Then they would probably have been in a position to do all this, extra spending on the capital front, and allocating more money to the social schemes as well. In fact, the allocation to the health sector has come down. It's come down from around 82,500 crore to some 74,000 crore. And the funny thing is, when Miss Sitaraman was speaking, she kept saying health and well-being, and I was like, yeah, health is a sector we all know of. What is this well-being that's suddenly been put out there? So once you sort of looked at the numbers, so the well-being obviously has one of the important entries is 35,000 crores on vaccination, which is, I guess, let's not be too harsh on the government, which is also a part of health. Then there are financial commission grants as well. So I think what was more disappointing was, or maybe they'll correct it in the days to come, is the fact that we still do not have a sort of a long-term vision on what the government plans to do on the health front, because our basic health system continues to remain in tatters. In fact, I mean, I can tell you in Mumbai, a lot of people who have a lot of money and were willing to spend money suddenly realized, when someone in the family got COVID, they realized that even going to a private hospital, the best private hospital, does not help, because there are people who are much better connected than you are, and there are people who have more money than you have, and they ended up in a mess. So even if you have money in this country, there is no guarantee that you're going to get the kind of treatment that is needed. So
Neil, just as a sidebar question, what's the gamble you think the government is playing with over here? You've got, they're guiding to a 6.8% fiscal deficit by the expenditure secretary's own words. Debt to GDP is possibly going to get closer to 90%. Social welfare scheme spending has gotten cut down. Are they sort of seeing this in an international context, saying, hey, everyone's in the same boat and everyone's spending hard, so we won't be penalized for it?
No, I think that's exactly right, Mithali. I think that uh, it's partly that, and partly, even if you're penalized for it, we will not suffer in some sense. There will still be some form of FDI coming in. And in fact, I would view the chief economic advisor's broadside against credit rating agencies in the economic survey as part of the, as what Shekhar Gupta calls anticipatory bail. Even if we get downgraded, मैंने पहले से बोला है, these fellows, they're biased against us, right? And so you won't suffer the political consequences. You might suffer the overall investment consequences. I mean, because in the end, there are many investment funds that will simply not be able to come into a country which has a junk status. Many people who go on the bond market from within India will find that the sovereign rating is the upper limit for them. It's the ceiling, and they can't. So therefore, they're stuck in junk status as well. I suspect here, however, Mithali, that part of what the other things that we've been seeing on the capital side, on the institutional side, for example, the development finance institution that's been promised, is a way of trying to manage a possible downgrade. So even if the sovereign is downgraded, we can somehow ensure that maybe the DFI still has investment grade rating, and therefore that whatever money was coming in may not come into what it was earlier, but it can be routed in through the DFI, right? So there are mechanisms that they put in place to try and prepare for a sovereign downgrade. I think that there's a big, of course, there's an assumption that because everyone is overspending, India will not be particularly penalized. But I think there's also that they're prepared to say to the markets, even if they are downgraded.
Vivek, let me ask you to rate some of those financial reforms, because on those, people did see them as forward-looking. 74% FDI in insurance, and ARC and AMC being set up for the banking side, DFI being set up as Mihir pointed out. On those, where would you sort of rate the budget and what it had to say?
So I think the FDI in insurance is a good idea. I mean, there is increasing the FDI in insurance by 25% to 74%. I mean, there's a lot of easy money floating around all across the world, and there is no reason for that money to keep coming in only in our stocks and in our bonds. So some of it can, come into our insurance companies as well, and hopefully a few thousand jobs can be created. So that's a good idea. As far as the idea of a bad bank is concerned, I am really not a great fan of it, and the reason is very simple. I mean, I don't see that how you will incentivize public sector banks to sell bad loans at a discount. Okay, I mean, this is a basic problem, and unless someone offers me a reasonably good explanation for it, I am not convinced about the idea. Having said that, I mean, the good thing is at least they're trying something. So, I mean, you can't hold that against them. DFIs, I mean, as we've seen, they were shut in the 1990s, and the problem right now is that, and at the risk of sounding very, 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 very cliched, we really do not have a corporate bond market. And a DFI essentially, what we're trying to do is that because we don't have a corporate bond market, we are trying to sort of get a DFI in and lend and so on and so forth. Now, the problem there is that, the DFI idea has been tried before, and it hasn't worked. The other problem was that, we had 27 public sector banks doing project finance. So that was also that was one extreme, because, you obviously cannot have, so many professionals working for so many institutions. So I don't know. I mean, the good thing is at least they're trying something, which is better than, the last few budgets where they had, there were no new ideas. At least these are old ideas being sold as new ideas. So you can't really hold that against them. But I don't think, I don't like the idea of bad banks in particular, because I don't see public sector bankers selling big loans at a discount, especially if the ARC turns out to be a private institution.
Mihir, where do you stand on this financial reform? Because, and just on this DFI point, a lot of people in the industry have also said that, boss, that's not our problem. I mean, we've seen an IDFC from the private side, we've seen an I. That's not the problem.
I think that to say that they didn't work in the 90s and therefore there's no need for them now, they won't work from now. The one point that misses is that we had a very different long-term finance situation in the 1990s. In particular, you did in fact have banks that were willing to lend, you're willing to take greater risks in terms of maturity mismatch at that point than we do now.
Okay.
All right. And for various reasons since then, some regulatory, some of the fact that they've been burnt twice, and some partly because now they've got all this on their books, we can't rely on bank finance. And so I think that what the DFI is a method of short-circuiting bank financing, and I don't think that's necessarily wrong, right? In fact, in retrospect, maybe we shouldn't have closed them in the 1990s. Right. I think that definitely, I don't want to single out any of them, but okay, fine. I think IDFC would have been better. Some of them would have been better as development finance institutions than as the banks they've turned out to be. Okay. But that aside, I think I want to return to this question that Vivek, the corporate market, because I'm puzzled by one little throwaway reference in the budget. And maybe Vivek knows more about this than I do. But there was a reference in the budget to a framework and a body that would buy corporate bonds of investment grade corporate paper.
Yeah,
now,
I saw. Yeah.
So what does this mean, Vivek? What are they thinking of? Because this seems to me to be incredibly puzzling.
Yeah, I don't know. Because no one's really sort of, none of the government bureaucrats or the minister has spoken about it. So no idea. It's just there, and it's just hanging there.
Because Mithali, if you think about this, there were some of the things that have been done over the past year, whether via the RBI and public sector and banks through the TLTRO, some other mechanisms as well, have basically directed some of the government's extra spending into investment grade corporate paper, right? And that helped a lot of the, let's say, the upper rank of corporations put a little bit of money into various things. Now, for the government to double down on this at this point, they have to assume that it's those guys really who are, the companies that are already investment grade that are not being able to raise cash. And I'm not sure that's the correct. And I'm not sure that's the correct, reading of the situation. So there's something else going on here. And I just, if the opposition never got hold of this and figured out what it meant, they'd be immediately, oh my God, all right, kahan paisa ja raha hai? Hamara paisa is going into the oligarchs again, etc., etc. Well, fortunately, nobody in the opposition besides Damaram can, read about it.
Also, now that we're talking about the RBI, while there is, a lot of people have said good things about the RBI, but at the end of the day, the kind of excess liquidity that continues to remain in the system
Correct.
is a cause for worry. And I don't I don't think they are sort of I mean they have a solution for it.
Yeah,
It's
no,
like,
they're just sitting with it. I mean,
yeah, I mean it's
it's
like
like
the
a dam and it's just building. Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean it's like the Hotel California song. So
yeah.
it's
Which brings me to my personal pet peeve, which is divestment, Vivek. And I think maybe we should stop calling it divestment, because divest karne ko, there's not that much left now. Move towards privatization. As you said, these very ambitious targets are set, and then they are very ambitiously missed, because I didn't hear, for example, any fresh names in the divestment list. The Air India, LIC. I know she mentioned two public sector banks, but we don't know what yet. Um, what are we doing wrong with divestment? What's not working for us?
I mean, see, the point is, in the last 20 years, we haven't, divestment has been a fraud. I mean, you get ONGC to buy HPCL and ONGC borrows for it, and the debt ends up on the books of ONGC and not on the not as an expenditure of Government of India. So, I mean, when you do all these things, so see, there has to be, the government hasn't privatized a substantial number of companies in the last 20 years. I mean, some of the biggest privatizations happened when Arun Shore was the disinvestment minister, and this is like 20 years back. So they need to get that going. It's as simple as that. If they get few of them going, I mean, then they should be able to do it. But nobody has been able to get that entire thing going as of now. So, and the problem is, if you try selling duds like Air India first, so obviously you will not get the system going. Now you want to sell three public sector banks. I mean, who in their right mind is going to buy three public sector banks? So
Well, there are lots of people not in their right mind in the corporate sector, so I think some of them will.
maybe they might. So
But Mihir, what do you do?
love the idea.
Mihir, what do you do when you want to divest LIC, because LIC is the one who finally buys?
yeah, I mean, so
Yeah,
Well,
ab kya karenge?
I think this is very interesting. I think the government has recognized it's come to the end of being able of this period when it can basically use LIC to finance its divestment program. And I think that a lot of what we see here, whether it is finally going forward, maybe with the LIC IPO, opening up the insurance sector, a lot of it is it's saying, okay, theek hai. I can't rely on LIC forever. And I think that that's very progressive if that's what they're thinking. It's always very difficult to figure out what they're thinking, but if that's what they're thinking, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Good for them. I won't disagree with both you and Vivek here. I think that in terms of privatization, we can now use the word because the budget speech used the word. And this is the first time since Arun Shori that budget has been able to use this word. Right. So we're talking about privatization. We're talking about a strategy for privatization. Certain sectors are strategic. Everything else we're just going to get completely out of as a government. And Niti Aayog will come up with another list of things. Now, we can disagree about whether they'll ever come out with something fun or something interesting. But the fact is that I think that what we are seeing here is an acknowledgement that they haven't gone far enough, that we have to start talking about wholesale privatization. And I would say, again, giving them the benefit of the doubt, that this is a turning point. And it's more, rhetorically, it's more than we've seen for privatization, again, since Arun Shori.
Okay,
I think, just one point. I agree with Mihir here. I mean, this is 2020, 21, 22 will be an important year because it's sort of, if they're able to pull it off this time, well and good. But after this, I mean, I'm really not sure what's going to happen. So,
Vivek, you live in India, yeah. Come on. After every year, there's another year, and then another year. हम लोग उम्मीद पे दुनिया कायम है. Just one last question to you guys. We've been talking about this at the top level. Meher, if you had to distill this into an individual impact, would you say the individual, the individual taxpayer came out of this largely unscathed? Because now there's some murmurs about what happens when the wage bill comes in April, for example, and the fact that there's going to be some trickle down effect even at the personal level in your payout, what your take home salary becomes. Any damage there?
Damage, yeah. I mean, the fact is that these guys chickened out. For a country in our position, rather than taking on debt, you should be trying. And after 3 years of a tax to GDP ratio that has been stagnant and underperforming indirect taxes, we should have been saying, Acha, now what's our direct tax plan? How do we raise taxes on the middle class? All right, because that's the only way that we actually get to some sense of fiscal security going forward. And the fact is that they chickened out on this. And the reason that we have this problematic fiscal glide path going forward is because they don't know what to do with direct taxes. They've locked themselves into this corner where now Vivek, for example, has four options as to how he has his income taxed. Is he old personal income tax, new personal income tax? Now he can also be a company of one, right? So is he using the old corporate tax system, new? I don't know.
That thing, yeah.
So in terms of, everyone's going around saying there's nothing in the middle class, or at least the middle class bach gaya. The fact is that this government is so indebted to the middle class, and they're so desperate to not have the middle class turn against them, that precisely at the moment you should be raising taxes on what is a coddled bunch of people in terms of taxes in this country, let's be fair. Okay, they're not actually doing it.
Yeah. Vivek is a celebrity journalist, Mihir. He attracts
Yeah.
wealth. He was in that category. Vivek, any individual impact?
No, not really. I mean, so, no news is good news, as they say. So, I sort of don't agree with Mihir on that tax thing. And
Finally, Mithali, some strong disagreement.
No. I mean, so it's like, actually my point is slightly different. I mean, there's not about being agreeing or not agreeing. See, I think, and I've been saying this for many years, I mean, our income tax system is in a mess. Okay. You have on one side a marginal rate of tax which goes as high as 43-44% if I'm, if my income is salaried. On the other hand, if I sort of make money by, let's say, selling gold in a particular year, or selling real estate, or by earning capital gains on my debt mutual fund, I get indexation benefits. And if the inflation is very high, and I mean, I have been a beneficiary of this, so I can say this. So for so many years, I sold my debt mutual funds and I never paid any tax on it. And on top of that, I accumulated long-term capital losses, which I sort of set off in the years to come. So, I find this bizarre that there is this one guy who's paying 44% tax, and there is this other guy who's not paying any tax at all. So there has to be some sort of rationalization here. Now, and this includes, it includes the stock market guys, it includes dividends, and so you can go on and on. I mean, and every year now we have, in fact, even this year there are a few things which have been introduced which will be taxed in a totally different way. So if your ULIP premium is more than 2.5 lakh rupees a year, your ULIP gains will be taxed like mutual fund gains. Now, what are you trying to do here? I mean, you're basically, enriching the chartered accountant. Or there's one more thing about how, if your payment in the employees provident fund is more than 2.5 lakhs, your gains will not be tax free, and you'll be taxed. Now, my point is कि आप इतना complicated कर दिया है आपने कि, I mean, if I were to sort of use colloquial language, इसको रायता फैला दिया बोलते हैं. So this needs to be, it needs to be cleaned up, because, and I'm not even getting into the argument about the Laffer's curve, about, at low rate, there is a high collection and all that. All I'm saying is that there has to be some amount of simplicity and equality in the entire income tax system. I mean, it's just bizarre. I mean, the kind of complications that have been introduced into the entire system. Then you say कि हम tax सरल बना रहे हैं. सरल, the moment you go beyond salaried income, it starts getting to be a mess. So
I think the central problem here, Mithali, is that unfortunately, when the government changed, they decided to start from terra nova in 2014 and say, okay, I know there's been work on a direct tax code, but we don't trust anything the previous government has done, so we're going to forget about a direct tax code.
We'll reinvent the wheel.
And the simple idea here has to be, and I agree with Vivek, that you have to try and create some kind of parity between different kinds of income, right? Whether it is long-term capital gains, whether it's interest income, whether it is interest income from different sources, whether it is dividend income or business income of one kind or another, and regular salaried income. And then once that is done, you make it easier to pay taxes, and then you start, reducing the exemptions in such a way that a larger proportion of the country pays maybe $500, $800, but pays a little bit of taxes, brings them into the system. And if that's basically how you do it.
Super fun conversation, gentlemen. Thank you so much. I think for
That's
anyone
lovely.
who's missed out on the highlights of the budget, this was really a fun ride in terms of the pluses, the minuses, the question marks. Thank you both very much for joining in and having this chat with me.
Thank you, Mithari.